Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. This episode explores how Britain's textile industry is being renovated for the 21st century. Learn how traditional technologies are being used in surprising ways to develop pioneering materials, from biomedical textiles used in the human body to aerospace vehicles exploring our solar system. Recorded live at the 2024 Bradford Literature Festival, hear how the innovative spirit that once powered the textile industry remains alive and well.
Thank you for coming along. I don't know how many of you came along because you just read a bit in the festival programme, but I did think it was a bit odd that it said photographer Tim Smith will be showing pictures taken over the last 120 years. I'm not that old, but I will be showing photographs on the screen here because that's what I do. I'm a photographer, but I also arrived in Bradford some 40 years ago in the mid-1980s to work for Bradford Museums. So a lot of the work that I've done as a photographer around Bradford, I've put together exhibitions and displays and worked as a press photographer using my own pictures, but also through Bradford Museums and other collections of historic pictures. I've also drawn on those quite a lot. The talk is actually billed as looking at how textiles are being kind of reinvented for the 21st century. And when I was talking to the Literature Festival people, I said, well, that's what I'd like to talk about. And they said, well, people like seeing pictures of old Bradford. So anyway, I don't know what your preferences are, but hopefully you like a bit of both, because for the first bit of the presentation, you're going to get pictures of old Bradford. And then there'll be a short film. So you're going to cue the film, yeah? Great. So there'll be a short film, which I'll explain. It's just 4 minutes long when we get there. And then the second half of the presentation will be pictures that I've taken over the last 40 years. And then towards the end, we'll get on to photos that I've taken over the last few years, which really kind of, well, let me talk about that when we get to it. So stick with us. If it's really awful, just go. But I think it gets more interesting towards the end. Anyway, that's for you to decide. We start off with this picture. I presume most people have got a vague geography of Bradford, but this was taken in the days when Bradford was the fastest growing town of the Industrial Revolution. And we don't care what they say in Manchester. They might have invented, they claim, the Industrial Revolution. But actually, it took off in Bradford. And in terms of the way Bradford grew with the mechanisation of textiles and so on, it was, for better or for worse, the fastest growing town. So this view, for those of you that know Bradford, this is the kind of King's Road, Queen's Road area. And this is where Canal Road is now. There's the old railway. This is the canal here, I think, that runs along here. And that was the main artery that brought all the raw materials in and took the raw materials out. It was initially the canal and then the railway. This is a view of the centre of Bradford, and we're sitting about here at the moment. And it's a kind of artist's view. Apparently they used to go up in a hot air balloon. Anyway. And that's the cathedral, that's the old post office, this is Forster Square. And as you can see, Bradford city centre was full of mill chimneys. Here's the Bradford Canal coming into the city centre. And I just want to take a couple of minutes just to explain why it is that Bradford became the preeminent woolen textiles place in Yorkshire. Because every little town and village had its own water mill to grind corn. And then when textiles was being mechanised, it was those water-driven mills that then became the factories, if you like. And so everywhere kind of started off, well, it didn't start off on an equal footing, but everywhere had its mill, because everybody needed flour from corn. But the reason Bradford outstripped everywhere else was it had wool. And I love this picture as a photographer. Occasionally I'll just break off to get a bit photographer-ish with you. But this was a picture taken at the conditioning house, which I'll mention in a minute. And it's almost like a kind of thing you might see in the Tate or something, I think, really. Or even, dare I say it, Cartwright Hall. I just think it's a lovely photo. So Bradford had wool, but everywhere else in Yorkshire had wool. But there was a coming together of stuff in Bradford that was all around. So it had wool, and it had an abundant supply of water. And apparently the water, I was in a dye house in Keighley last week, and they were going on about the wonderful Bradford water. And it's really soft water. So when you make your Yorkshire tea, that tastes nice, yeah. But also, it's ideal for washing wool and finishing textiles. Initially you needed the water to drive your water wheels for the power, but also Bradford had this abundant supply of ideal water, so that was in its favour too. And the other thing it had was loads of Yorkshire stone, because if you're going to build lots of new factories, you need stuff to build them with. So you've only got to look out here and see. Yeah. And everywhere you go in Bradford, if you just look for kind of, holes, they're everywhere. And those holes were often quarries. And there were quarries all over Bradford producing some of the best stone in the country. And the other thing that it had was the biggest ironworks in the north of England. So Lowmore is going up towards Wibsey. Basically, they had these massive coal deposits and iron deposits. And if you've got the same two things in the same place, obviously it makes it cheaper because you don't have to move stuff about. So Lowmore was this massive industrial complex where they mined coal and then they burnt coal to smelt the iron that they mined or extracted or whatever it is in the same place. And this is actually an advertising flyer from an agent for the United States and Canada. So not only did Bradford have the metals that you needed to make textile machinery, but they used to send this iron out all over the world. And I used to have this long list in my head of famous things and places where Lowmore iron was used. But like that metal bridge next to the Sydney Opera House, that's built from Lowmore iron, as were the cannons at the Battle of Trafalgar. And just, if you're interested in all this stuff, just look at Wikipedia and it'll tell you how all this stuff from Bradford, not just textiles, went all over the world. So that's the stuff they used to build the textile machinery, together with the coal. And then obviously once the age of steam came in, you needed lots of coal to power your steam engines. And where I used to live on Bale, at the foot of Baildon Hill, if you go up on the top of Baildon Hill, it's full of old mine workings. And Bradford itself is full of old mine workings. I mean, it's all mined out now. So you have places like George Hodgson's, who made power looms. And this was just, where Forster Square Station is now, that's the lines going up Canal Road. So this is just one loom maker, which, does anyone in the room ever heard of George Hodgson's? Oh, well done, 2. Well, I'm impressed, anyway. But that was just one of dozens and dozens of engineering factories making stuff for the textile trade. And they made it not only for the trade in Bradford, but they exported it all over. Keighley was a textile engineering town. Places like Hattersley's, which most people will probably have heard of, Hattersley's was the most famous loom maker. And there's one of those amazing Yorkshire stone buildings. So those were the four things that gave Bradford its like industrial leg up, if you like. So it was water, wool, coal, iron, stone, all in one place. Does anyone have any questions? We can have some questions at the end, but if anyone wants to ask a question as we go along, just stick your hand up or make a noise. And then you had things like the conditioning house down below the Forster Square retail park, which is now all posh apartments and stuff. But that was the place that set the standards for the wool industry. Not just here, but worldwide. So you'd take these samples of wool in and they'd measure it for... Now I know there's some textile people in the audience. I'm a bit nervous about getting technical about things because I'm not a textiles expert. But they used to test it for things like water content and tensile strength and this and that. And on the back of that, here we are. Here's some testing work going on at the conditioning house. So by the time it reached the wool exchange, the trade, this was the centre of the woolen textiles trade globally, and people would look at the kind of, I don't know, the conditioning house spec, if you like, and this is where those big mega deals would take place with wool being bought and sold from all over the world. And they do say that there were more, in Victorian times, there were more Rolls Royces in Bradford, maybe a bit, actually, early 20th century, there were more Rolls Royces in Bradford than anywhere else in the country. Because there was a lot of money here. And these were the guys that made the money. Unlike Mr. Butterworth, who owned Cliff Castle up in Keighley. Just this incredible wealth for the people that ran the trade. Oh, it's quite useful having a timer. But as well as wealth, there was a lot of poverty. And there's an amazing set of photographs by a Methodist guy called Christopher Pratt, who used his camera as a kind of campaigning tool, partly to get people out of the pub and into the chapel, but also to kind of, I don't know, educate the well-to-do of Bradford about the lot of your average mill worker, which was pretty dire back in the Edwardian times. And there was just a huge number of different processes that went on in and around Bradford. So again, herons. Anyone heard of herons? Yes? Maybe you can give the talk next year. But herons, you know, I wouldn't say it was a well-known mill in Bradford, but it did almost everything. It was what they called a vertical mill, where they'd... No?
It is a mistake to put the word woolen and Bradford in the same sentence. The word woolen refers to a specific industry, the woolen industry, which was a vertical industry. The woolen mills generally took wool in and sent out finished pieces, finished woolen cloth, you see. And but worsted was horizontally.
Wasn't worsted made of wool?
Yes, but it wasn't woolen. Woolen is a specific industry. If you want to talk about, please use the term wool textile rather than woolen.
Okay.
In textile terms, the
definition.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. It's very, very common. Very common. And there's a wonderful book come out called Bradford in 50 Buildings. It's excellent, except it talks about Bradford was a centre of the woolen industry. It wasn't. Leeds was a centre of the woolen industry. Guiseley and Yeadon. And then you had the heavy woolen.
Okay. Well, I think we've got the point about Bradford. Yeah. Thank you. They were wool merchants and top makers. But they employed a lot of people. And the reason I'm showing these pictures is just to show the kind of scale of these places. And these are the places that have now disappeared. Because Bradford used to produce huge volumes of textiles with huge volumes of people. These are burlers and menders. And people used to come from all over the world to work in textiles. Like, for example, a lot of Italian, can't remember the name of this firm, but a lot of Italian women came to work doing burling and mending. And as well as the actual wool textiles trade, there was just this vast industry that kind of, well, like allied trades that complemented it, if you like. This is the kind of science and testing lab at Salt's Mill. But then you had all these other things separate to the mill. And this is an optician who, well, it says it on the tin, made spectacles for weavers. So even if you were just something like an optician, a lot of what you did for a living depended on the textile trade. They were only 21 shillings a pair. These cost a lot more from Specsavers. And I worked for an outfit called the Bradford Heritage Recording Unit, which was part of Bradford Museums. And back in the 90s, we made a book called Textile Voices, and then we did a new edition in 2005, I think it was, which is this book here. Which, if you're interested in it, you can find it secondhand generally. For everything from £2 to 50 quid. So await your moment and you'll get it cheap. And it's a mixture of the kind of photographs that I've been showing you so far and oral histories, because back in the 80s and early 90s, I and my colleagues went out and interviewed a lot of former textile. Well, some of them were former textile workers and some of them were still working in textiles at that time. And we used their stories to complement the photos in this book. And it is a fascinating read. But I would say that, wouldn't I? So I'm now going to show you some photographs that I took. Because at the Heritage Unit, we had what we called the historic archive. And then we had what we called the contemporary photos. But the contemporary photos have now become the archive. Because people in museums at that time, I mean, museums are very different now, but back then, people in museums kind of said, well, why are you going out and taking photos of this stuff that's happening now? Museums are about what happened in the past. And we just said to them, just wait. And I'm glad we did it, because the photos that I've shown you up to now, apart from the Christopher Pratt ones, were mainly taken by commercial photographers for commercial reasons. So they came in and they, made it all seem quite nice. And, the mill would have a good clean before the photographer came in. And I'm not saying that me and the other photographers at the Heritage Unit went in to paint some kind of dirty, dismal view. But what we generally did was just turn up and do that kind of fly-on-the-wall documentary thing. So this isn't a kind of commercial photo. It's about how noisy it was working in a mill. And this is Lister's Mill at Bingley. They're winding silk for silk velvet, which they're making here. So I think most people in the audience are old enough to remember sitting on a red velvet seat in the Odeon or any other cinema. Yes? Anyway, maybe the first time you ever held someone's hand was while you were sitting on a bit of velvet made in Lister's Mill. Because again, they used to make huge quantities of it. And the thing I love about textile mills and being a photographer is that, first of all, you need lots of light to see what you're doing, particularly in weaving and spinning and stuff. So that's partly why you get that characteristic architecture with the north light coming in. But it also means that it was almost like going into Lister's was like working in this huge daylight photo studio with this beautiful soft light coming in. So that was great. And also just all these amazing patterns of things. Textiles is a very patterny industry, if that's, sorry, I'm not very good at this arty aesthetic talk, but you just, you know, the way, I suppose part of I felt my job as a photographer was to record what was going on, but to do that in a kind of aesthetically interesting way. And actually, doing that in a textile mill wasn't as difficult as some other places, just because it was there and it was lovely. And I just like little details, like here's the guy's coat and cap. The commercial photographer would have probably cleaned it all up. And here's his little workstation. Because did anyone here, yeah, obviously people here will have worked in textiles, yeah? There's quite a few nods. And if you had any status at all, you had your own little desk and chair, didn't you? And other people just had to lean on things or sit on a skep or whatever. This is Daniel Illingworth's Wetley Mills down Thornton Road. This is Leach and Thompson Foundry up in Keighley, which is still going. And originally they made, their kind of stock in trade was making textile machinery parts. And now they still do the same thing, but generally, well, they cast you anything, but they do a lot of work for historic properties and the National Trust and all that kind of thing. Just opposite Dalton Mills, if you know where Dalton Mills is. And then you've got other companies who used to make stuff for the textile industry, well, like Leach and Thompson's, I suppose, and now make things for completely different industries. Like, this is Spooners, which is a big factory in Ilkley. And Spooners were founded and made their reputation and their money from making finishing machines for the textile industry, like great big dryers. And so they're experts in engineering large metal machines with hot air in them, basically. There's no one from Spooners here, is there? No, good. Well, it's a bit more sophisticated than that, but they've taken that kind of those skills and that expertise, and now they make ovens for bread makers and what have you. And it's still a huge factory, because everyone thinks, oh, Ilkley tea rooms and Betty's and all that. But Spooners, I think, is the biggest employer there, still making stuff. I had a long relationship with Drummond's Mill, and we'll show you a film in a minute. When I first went to Drummond's, it wasn't churning out cloth in the same quantity that it used to in its heyday. Drummond's is a mill up on Lum Lane. But when I first went there, one of its main customers was Marks and Spencer's. And it still made worsted suitings for Marks and Spencer's, because Marks and Spencer's had this policy to use British cloth. But once that policy was kind of discontinued, then Drummond's and other people that supplied Marks and Spencer's, a lot of them, that was the beginning of the end, really. And I did read, or I heard somewhere, that the last group of textile workers in Drummond's, I think, week before Christmas 2002, was the last day of production at Drummond's. So I photographed them doing that, which you'll see in the film, and then I accompanied the caretaker round as he locked everything up for the last time, which was quite a kind of poignant moment. So there he is with his padlock. And then there's other mills like Lister's, and I took this, I think, in the early 90s. Is that when they were planning on making it into the V&A or something? Anyway, that never came to pass, but that's one of the huge weaving sheds which has now been divvied up into apartments. Because I did some work for Urban Splash when they were doing it up, and I referred to them as flats once. Which was, no, they're not flats, they're apartments. Anyway, they're very nice, but you just, I don't know. space is money in developers' terms. So it's not like going to Sorts Mill where you get a sense of that scale. You don't get that inside anymore, but you do get a sense of scale from outside. Anyway, I'll just show you, or your man will show you this short little film, and then we'll move on to how all this stuff that was happening back in Bradford's heyday kind of continues, but in a slightly different way.
Drummond's Lum Lane Mills opened in Manningham, just north of Bradford's city centre, in 1886. Its distinctive chimney and the buildings that lie below it have been a familiar sight on the city skyline ever since. In 1991, Bradford-based photographer Tim Smith made the first of many visits to Drummond's Mill. This film uses the photographs he took over the next 25 years to explore the life of one of the city's most renowned landmarks. During Bradford's textile heyday, Drummond's products were exported all over the world, but by the 1990s, the mill was manufacturing just a small fraction of the cloth it made in earlier times. However, a large and highly skilled workforce remained, producing large quantities of high-quality fabrics for customers such as Marks and Spencer. These photographs show what they did, from the production of patterns and the spinning of yarn to the mending and finishing of cloth. Ten years later, Tim Smith returned to photograph the Heritage Textile Company, the last manufacturer of textiles at Drummond's Mill. These pictures were taken during the week before Christmas, 2002, on the final day of textile production at Drummond's. Over 100 employees lost their jobs, leaving less than 1,000 people working in the textile industry in Bradford. Many areas of the huge 7-acre site remained empty after the mill workers had left. The owners, SKA Textiles, rented out other spaces for storage, offices and workshops. In 2011, a local theatre company, Freedom Studios, produced a play at Drummond's called The Mill, City of Dreams. The cast of professional actors and local people led audiences through a set of huge, empty buildings. The script was inspired by interviews with former mill workers. It explored the relationships between people who had travelled from all over the world to work making textiles at Drummond's. In January 2016, Tim visited Drummond's for the last time, with plans to use some of these empty spaces for an exhibition of photographs taken of Bradford's textile industry over the previous 30 years. These plans came to nothing. On the 28th of January 2016, a small fire started in the basement of the main 5-storey mill building. Over the next 24 hours, the flames spread and Drummond's was devastated by a massive blaze. A demolition company was hired to clear the site of the blackened ruins, as many in Bradford mourned the loss of an icon of our shared textile history. Just the chimney and the single building below it remain.
So that was a little film that was sponsored by Bradford 2025 when they were bidding for this City of Culture thing. And I would say, did anyone see that Freedom Studios show? Yeah? I thought it was great. Yeah. So if 2025 do put anything on about textiles in an empty mill, I don't know whether they are or aren't, I'd recommend going and seeing it.
Before it burns down.
Well, it is a sad story, and I think that story was typical of many mills in Bradford. But there are still a lot of physical mills around, and I, like I think most other people, well, people not connected to textiles, just thought textiles was dead and buried in Bradford. And it's true, Bradford doesn't make textiles in the same way or the same volumes with the same numbers of people that it used to, but it still does do some really interesting stuff, which is what the second half of this talk is about. So, I can't remember why I was in Haworth one day, but I parked at the bottom of the hill down near the Keighley and Worth Valley railway sheds. There was a mill at the bottom of the hill. And there was a skip, and this bloke came out and chucked some stuff in a skip. And I said, "Oh, are you clearing out the mill?" And he was quite insulted and said, "No, we're not. We're still working." I said, "Oh, really?" And that is the home of Weaving. So I chatted to him, and this is what you do as a photographer. You have to, well, I'm a photographer, I think, because I'm nosy. That's my main motivation. Anyway, I had a chat with him, and then I rang them and found out what they were doing. And this is Robin Wright, who runs the family firm. And this is what they do, mainly. They make braids and accoutrements. And they're still making braids and accoutrements because they have a specialist knowledge. And they've got all these machines. I think it's like over 200 different machines in there that other people don't have anymore. So if you ever see anything royal or whatever on the telly, then it's likely that Weideen have made most of the fancy bits. And they export this stuff to over 60 other countries worldwide. You know, like I was in there last week and they were weaving the Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, have a yellow stripe down their trousers. And they were weaving the Canadian Mounties' yellow stripe. They made, well, let me rephrase that. They did some good business out of the coronation. Because suddenly everything has to change from E to R to CR3. Absolutely everything. So this is the home of CR3 stuff, really. So these are sashes, ceremonial sashes, that they make thousands of yards of these every year. But they also make some really amazing things. And here, using these old Victorian, what they call narrow fabric looms, so for medal ribbons and sashes and trims and mounties, leg thingies, they make them on these looms. But what they've discovered is that these specialized these looms and braiding machines can make very specialist textile structures, as they call it. And they won't tell me what they're making because no one's allowed to know, but they're weaving glass fiber yarn into high-strength, heat-resistant fabrics that get used in jet engines. That's all I know. And this old Victorian loom here, I was in there once and I said to Joe, who runs the store, I said, "Oh, what are you making there?" She said, "We're not allowed to tell you." And being the nosy person I am, I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I saw this little label on the loom that said orthox, it said, this sticker. So when I got home, I Googled orthox, and it's this biomedical spin-off firm from Oxford University. They are making... Is anyone here due a new knee replacement? No, well, that's good. Because when they give you a knee replacement, they basically take your knee out from here to here. It's very expensive. It's very intrusive. There's a huge recovery time, and it's generally not a nice thing to do until you get better. And the main reason why you need a knee replacement is because your cartilage is worn out. You know that meniscus. Is yours worn out, Dusty? No. Right. Anyway, mine are wearing out. But that your meniscus is the thing that makes your knee move about in a painless fashion. And that's why people have knee replacements. And what they're doing here is weaving silk to make artificial knee cartilage. So instead of having your knee chopped out, they do some, I mean, it's a bit, this is in layman's terms, it's a bit more complicated than this, but they weave this silk, they send it down to the lab in Oxford, and they're in the business of putting it through all these medical trials, and hopefully, instead of having your knee replaced, they do some clever kind of keyhole surgery and just slip this replacement cartilage in. And that's being made on an old Victorian loom in Haworth. And they make things for space satellites. You can weave anything. I meant to bring it with me, but at home on my office windowsill, I've got a femoral artery, which was woven in Leeds. So if anyone needs one, I've got one. There it is. And this, David, who sadly passed away recently, anyway, David, it's all to do with the size of the weave, and your body likes natural stuff, so it thinks, oh, silk, that's organic. Medical implants get rejected because the body doesn't like them, but apparently it quite likes silk, so it becomes, this is the plan, it becomes part of your knee. Oh, I've got 15 minutes. There they are doing their clever stuff in Oxford with silk woven in Haworth. Carbon, they weave carbon now. And the great thing about carbon textiles is they're incredibly, incredibly strong, and they're incredibly, incredibly light. So most fighter jets and all that, space satellites, they're all made out of woven carbon. And trying to get into a weaving carbon factory was a nightmare because it's MOD and it's top secret, and come in here with a camera, you've got to be joking. And then I was talking to a bloke on a train once who had well, that's what you do. Be curious, have a conversation with somebody and you'll find out something you don't know. And he said he was covered in mud and he had a bicycle with him. And it cost him $6,000, but he was really keen on mountain biking. And it was made out of woven carbon because he could pick it up like that. And he said, so I said, oh, that's interesting, and blah, 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 blah. And he said, oh, we'll get in touch with Hope Bicycles in Barnoldswick, where I got my bike from. And because it's not top secret, it's just a bicycle made out of woven carbon, then they let me in. So there they are. And I met a man from the RAF recently in Settle. And he doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to talk to him about fighter jets and see if he can get me into one of their factories. Because if you go up to Lancashire, it's full of Rolls-Royce and BAE Systems, huge factories. And why are they there? They're there because they used to do textiles, and now they have taken that technology and that skill base and what have you, and they're now making, I don't know, billion-pound contracts for whoever on the back of the textile industry. This is an incredibly clever 3D loom in Leeds University. Bradford University was set up as a technical college for textile workers, as was Leeds, the cloth workers' hall and all that. And they've got one of, I think it's 4 or 5 looms in the country where they can weave almost anything. So they have contracts with commercial companies or whoever who say, well, this is what we want, like a femoral artery. Can you weave it? And they work together using their textile expertise and their clever machine to do these prototypes. And then if it works, then they go off into production with whoever. And again, as a photographer, sometimes it's just about making a nice picture. This is basalt, which is a mineral. So they make fibres out of basalt and weave it into these kind of honeycomb structures. Because, you know, there's been all this, well, anyway, let's not get into building technology. But the problem with reinforced concrete is the steel rods rot the concrete. So that's why all that stuff in the 60s is falling down or being taken down. But now they're weaving honeycomb structures that they can pour out of non-corrosive materials like basalt that they can pour the concrete in. And a honeycomb weave is stronger than steel. So bridges, high-rises are all relying on textiles. This is micro-spinning, where they spin using electrical currents. And they produce these membranes that are so fine that they can adjust the fineness, if that's a word, the fineness to filter out different size molecules. So, for example, if you've got a problem with polluted water, they work out what size of molecule you want to let through and what size of molecule you don't, and weave something or spin something that's permeable in terms of water filtration. And this is Sorts Mill. This is just a few months before the pandemic, when most of the work that I've just shown you was produced for this exhibition that we made called Weaving the Future. So as well as the photographs, which were printed onto textiles, because we thought, well, if the raison d'etre as the show is you can weave anything, we better let people weave our exhibition. So they weren't tapestries, they were digital prints on woven fabric, which was done by a lab in an old mill up in Keighley. And here's your honeycomb building stuff. Here's your femoral arteries. Can't remember what they were. But this is all stuff that was woven on that clever 3D loom in Leeds Uni. I'll just whiz through these quickly, because there's one other thing that I think is quite fascinating about textiles. And I kind of had this, what's it called? I don't know, big go moment. Who was that guy that sat in the bath? Who? Eureka, thank you. I had my Eureka moment when I went to this old carpet factory in Crossley's Mill, Dean Clough. And there was a little corner of it where they were still weaving old carpets. And they had all the jacquard's a kind of loom, they had all the jacquard patterns going back, I don't know, whenever Crossley's was set up, 200 years ago or something. So if you had a 200-year-old carpet in your posh house, if you had the serial number, you could ring them up or even email them and say, can you weave us? Oh, I think they also had order books. So if you're in, I don't know, Harwood House and you want your drawing room carpet replaced and they wove it, they'd pull the old patterns off, stick them on a loom and make you a new one. And can you see these dots here? Yeah, it's a bit of a small screen, sorry. But basically, there's the warp that goes through the cloth and there's the weft that goes across it. And depending on which thread, whether it's the warp or weft on the top, and depending what colour that is, you can weave an infinite number of different patterns, just from what's hidden underneath and what's showing on top. And the thing that decides whether the warp's on top or the weft is on top is a hole or not a hole. Does that kind of make sense? There's a few blank faces and a fair bit of nodding, but we better leave it there because I've got 6 minutes. So jacquard pattern cards, or punch cards, or they're called all sorts of things, are basically a grid, like a bit of graph paper, with a hole or a not hole. And from that hole or not a hole, you can weave an infinite variety of different patterns. And that's what I kind of call binary analog system. And here they are using a jacquard loom to make these fancy fabrics. And out of that became digital technology. And nowadays you have a 1 or a 0, and that digital binary system grew out of jacquard pattern cards. And a man called Babbage and a woman called Ada Lovelace and all these things. Anyway, that's another thing where textiles has a huge influence on what runs our modern world. And just for the last 5 minutes, I'll click through quickly some other pictures that I took for the Weaving the Future show, which just show how firms in West Yorkshire don't make huge volume stuff, that they make a little bit of money on huge volumes, but they make high-value goods, like this man near Dewsbury, who just makes bespoke carpets for corporate firms. Or Laxton's spinning mill, which is in a big industrial shed in Charlestown at the bottom of Beldon, where everything is temperature and humidity controlled, and they can produce this incredibly fine woolen thread, which they're doing here. And there's only, well, look at that. How many people can you see? 2. So all this machinery is incredibly sophisticated, highly technical, and it works, because you only really need people to set it up, take it down, or fix it when it's not working. So that's why they can produce stuff and make a profit on it, because it's the cost of labour in this country that puts us at a disadvantage, whereas all this high labour input stuff has gone to India, Turkey, well, all over the world where labour's a lot cheaper. And like your man was saying earlier, there's this network, this ecosystem of firms that process this high-quality yarn. This is Bulmer and Young out at Fairweather Green. And again, as a photographer, it's about going into places like that and thinking, ooh, that's a nice picture. And I waited ages for these blue things to come through, because I could see them down the line, and the green, well, maybe not, and the yellow. But then I waited for the blue and the red. And this is the more traditional dye house next door. This is a carpet factory in Dewsbury with these huge, huge, huge looms, probably the width of this audience here, with these incredibly complex creels feeding thousands of ends into a loom. And then when you get a broken end, it's a bit of a pain, because you've got to crawl into the back of the machine to fix it. So next time you go into Wetherspoons, if you ever do, then they make all the carpets for Wetherspoons. This is Pennine Weavers in Keighley, who are a worsted manufacturer. Your man's nodding, I got it right. And they make top quality cloth for suitings that may be designed in Italy, but they're woven in Keighley, and they're sold across the Far East and the Middle East and the Arab world. and to footballers and people with loads of money. Was anyone here wearing a Pennine weaver's suit? No, you see. There we are. I don't know how much a metre that comes out at, but it's top quality cloth. And Abraham Moon's in Guiseley, which is a vertical mill. It's a woolen mill. Hooray, we've got to the woolen bit. Yeah. And this is a spinning machine. And again, as a photographer, it's kind of, I don't know. I walked past this machine a couple of times, and then I walked past it again, and your man in the blue was weaving yellow yarn, not weaving it, spinning it on bobbin holder things, whatever they're called. And again, just that's, as a photographer, what you look for is that the composition and the colour and the light and the whatever. And they make a lot of nice posh shawls. And Hainsworth's in Leeds are still going. And they do a lot of technical fabrics, like heat stuff for firemen. Everything these days is BS, whatever, British standard, safety, fire resistant, and that's something they specialise in. But they also, apparently, make the best snooker and pool bays in the world. And snooker players apparently are very fussy about their bays, and they make it. These are the little... Oh, I've got 3 times. I'm coming to the end. This is the second to last one. These are the dampers that you get on pianos. And they do all the dampers. Are they dampers? Anyway, you know those... Yeah, they are dampers. So they make all the dampers for Steinways and for people that make expensive flutes. And for whom the bell tolls. They make eco-coffins out of wool. So if you want a non-polluting burial, get in touch with Hainsworth's. And I'm not on commission. Anyway, that's the end, because it's 3 o'clock. So if you've got any questions, hang around and I'll be here.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share this episode with others and leave a rating. Mark your calendars for the return of Bradford Literature Festival on Friday the 27th of June to Sunday the 6th of July 2025.